Okay, ladies, here is the homework from 10.1 from last night's homework. Here are the two even answers that you had, 30 and 42. If you have questions on any of the problems, I suggest you ask each other for help or go find another algebra teacher. They'd be glad to help you. I will go over 34B because I felt like there might be questions on that one. But I'll give you about a minute to check these and then we'll get started. Just as a reminder, 10.4, what we're doing today, is not going to be on your quiz tomorrow. But 10.1, 10.2, and 10.3, including the calculator, will be on your quiz tomorrow. Okay, so let's go over 43 really quickly with your manila rope problem. So, the equation was W equals 8,900 D squared, where W was the breaking strength and D was the diameter. So hopefully you can graph that function without a problem. Remember, you don't want the graph though where W or D would be negative, because that really doesn't make sense. So part B though, it's asked if the manila rope has 4 times the breaking strength of another. So if the breaking strength of 1, call it for W1, equals 4 times of W2 rope, just rope 1 versus rope 2. Don't let this confuse you. Okay. If rope 1 has 4 times, or rope 2 has 4 times the breaking strength of rope 1, does it have 4 times the diameter? Well, let's look. Let's look at what happens to the diameter. So if I multiply the whole thing by 4, since we're looking at 4 times the diameter, what happens? Is the diameter really being multiplied by 4? Well, when we look at this, we really have 4W equals 4 times 8,900 D squared. Well, 8,900 is just a constant. So I'm going to look at how the 4, I'm just going to move the 4 with the D. Write it this way. So when I do that, if I treat D, let's call it capital D. So if this is my new one, 8,900 times my new D with the 4 times the breaking strength. How does D compare to 4D squared? Because they should be the same. Or I should say compared to the original D. Well, with this, if this d represents 4 times the breaking strength, then big D is equal to 4 times d squared. Because this is, I'm treating as my 4 times the breaking strength. So really, when I'm solving, I should say d squared, excuse me, I apologize. Big D is the new diameter. So when I'm solving, I take the square root and I have 4d squared, which gives me 2d. So as I can see that my new diameter compared to my old is only twice as big. So it's no, because it's only 2 times as big. So that can be a little confusing. Don't really worry about anything like that on your quiz. If you have more questions on it, then we can go over it when I get back. But there won't be a problem like that on your quiz, so don't stress too hard about that right now. Oopsies. So, moving on to the notes. We have our warm-up. I'll give you a couple minutes to do that really quickly. Okay, so now we're going to solve. Leave the negative out front. Square root of 49, 7. So that answer is negative 7. 200. Well, square root of 200 is not a perfect square. But if we look at factors of 200, we see that it's 2 times 100. Well, then all that means is I can look at the square root of 200 as 2 times 100. Square root of 2 is still not a perfect square, so I'm going to leave that. But the square root of 100 is 10, so I'll put that on the outside. And that's how we evaluate. Another way we can look at it is if we look at the buddy system, if we remember that, I get a pair, so that means I can pull a 10 out, and 2 doesn't have a pair, so it just stays. Now remember, this sign just means I want the positive version and the negative version of the number. So I'm going to leave that, plus or minus square root of 121. Well, hopefully we all know that to be 11. So the answer is plus or minus square root of 11. So a ball is dropped from a height of 9 feet. So remember, dropped means velocity is 0 above the ground. How long does it take to hit the ground? Well, when I'm using my equation, h equals negative 16t squared plus vt plus s. V is 0 because it's dropped and my starting height is 9. and I'm looking for it to hit the ground, so h is 0. So 0 equals negative 16 t squared plus 9. So we can't factor out a GCF, but I can pull out a negative one. So let's look at what happens. So I have 16t squared minus 9. So as I'm factoring this, I realize I have a subtraction and I have two perfect squares. So that means I have 4t plus 9 times 4t minus 9. So that means t is equal to negative 9 fourths. Oh, excuse me, that's not a 9, that's a 3. So 4t plus 3, 4t minus 3. So I have t is equal to negative 3 fourths and a positive 3 fourths. But I don't want negative seconds, so it takes 3 fourths of a second to hit the ground. Okay. So now we're going to solve quadratic equations. Again, these are solving the equations neither by factoring or by looking at the graph. Okay, so what's really important here is that we get x squared, that we get it by itself. Oh, goodness. Get it by itself. Okay? If d is positive, if whatever this number ends up on the other side to be positive, then we have two solutions. If d is positive, then we have two solutions. If d equals to 0, then we only have one solution, which is 0. If d is negative, it has no solution, because you can't take a square root of a negative. Square root of a negative. So that's why there is no solutions. So this is solving just by using algebra, not graphing or factoring. Okay? What's important to know that this only works for forms like a x squared plus c equals 0. There can't be a b value. If there is, then you have to factor. Okay. So let's practice. Again, you want to get x squared by itself. So in part A, you divide by 2. X squared is equal to 4. Okay? So then x is equal to, we would say 2 normally. Okay? But it's actually plus and minus 2. Because if I were to look at a graph of this equation, it would cross the x-axis twice, at positive 2 and at negative 2. So I want plus and minus 2. If you forget that, you will lose points. Positive version and the negative. And it's because I can plug in a positive 2 here and get 2 times 4 equals 8 still. And I can plug in the negative 2 version and still get 2 times 4, which is 8. So don't forget the plus and minus. If we move on to B, we add 18 to both sides, which gives me 0. When you take the square root, it's 0. Don't worry about plus or minus 0. That's irrelevant. 0 doesn't have a sign. C, we subtract 12. So b squared is equal to a negative 7. Hopefully you notice this number is negative, obviously. And I can't take a square root of a negative, so we just have no solution. In this case, z squared is equal to 9/4. Not a perfect square, but each numerator and denominator is a perfect square, so I want to simplify that. Square root of 9 is 3. Square root of 4 is 2. Again, plus and minus. Okay. Alright, so not every number is going to be a perfect square, but we can approximate just by rounding and using your calculator. So in this case, again, I want to get x squared by itself. So I'm going to add 11. I get 3x squared is equal to 18. Divide by 3. I have x squared is equal to 6. Now when I take the square root of both sides, I get x is equal to plus or minus square root of 6. But it tells me to round because 6 is not a perfect square. So when I plug in square root of 6 in the calculator, don't try to put in plus and minus, okay? But when I plug in square root of 6 in the calculator, 6 plus and minus out front, plug in square root of 6, I get 2.45 rounded to the nearest hundredth. So that is what x is, rounded to the nearest hundredth. Okay. So here we want to solve. Okay, typically when we see these types of problems, I would have you factor. Let's look at what happens here. So I'm going to divide both sides by 6. So I get x minus 4 squared is equal to 7. Okay? Well, the problem is when I factor, this side has to be 0. But this side also has to be simplified. So let's simplify the left side. When I do that, I have x squared minus 8x plus 16 is equal to 7. Now we make it equal to 0. X squared minus 8x plus 9 is equal to 0. Okay? We would try to factor this, right? X equals 0. What factors of a positive 9 give me a negative 8? If I look at factors of 9, I get 3 and 3, 1 and 9, negative 3, negative 3, negative 1, negative 9. None of those added together will give me a negative 8. I'll either get 6, 10, negative 6, or negative 10. So this can't be factored. But you can still find it by hand. Okay? So, let's look. I'm going to still jump to where I had divided by 6. Equals to 7. Well, I can take the square root to get rid of the square. Then I'll have x minus 4 equals plus and minus negative 7. Do not forget the plus and minus here, otherwise this will throw you off. Solve for x. X equals, I'm going to add 4, but I'm going to put it in the front. 4 plus and minus 7. Well, what this plus and minus again means is I'm considering the positive version and the negative version. So what that's saying is x is equal to 4 plus square root of 7, and x is equal to 4 minus square root of 7. So this, when I type it into my calculator, gives me 6.65 to the nearest hundredth, and this gives me 1.35 to the nearest hundredth. Those are my solutions rounded. Okay? Just because it can't be factored does not mean there's no solution. There is a solution. It's just not a nice number. So again, to check it when you've got your calculator, you want to type in the first version, well, just this version, but make it equal to 0, so you'd have to bring the 42 over. And then find the zeros, like you know how to do, and your zeros should get you to be about these numbers. Okay, so we're going to do a couple more of those for practice. First, we divide by 2. X minus 2 squared is equal to 9. I take the square root. I get x minus 2 is equal to plus and minus 3. 9's a perfect square, makes my life easier. So I get x is equal to 2 plus or minus 3. Well, again, that means x is equal to 2 plus 3, and x is equal to 2 minus 3. So that it means x is 5 and negative 1. Number 11. I divide by 4. Q minus 3 squared is equal to 7. I take the square root of both sides. So I get q minus 3 is equal to plus and minus the square root of 7. So q is equal to 3 plus and minus the square root of 7. Again, means q is equal to 3 plus square root of 7, and q is equal to 3 minus the square root of 7. When I type both of those versions into my calculator, I get 5.65 and I get 0.35. Okay, for 12, again, divide by that 3. T plus 5 squared is equal to 8. Square root both sides. T plus 5 is equal to plus or minus the square root of 8. So t is equal to negative 5 plus or minus the square root of 8. When I do both versions, I get negative 2.17 and negative 7.83. And those are my solutions. So during an ice hockey game, a remote-controlled blimp flies above the crowd and drops a tennis ball. We got to figure out the amount of time that the ball is in the air. Well, again, it's dropped. So that means velocity is equal to 0. My starting height, if I look at the diagram, my starting height is 45. But my ending height is not being dropped to the ground. My ending height, if I look at this picture, it's this little dude catching the ball 17 feet in the air. So my ending height is 17. So I'm going to plug in what I know. 17 is equal to negative 16 t squared plus 0t plus 45, which is 17 is equal to negative 16t squared plus 45. Alright, there's no b value, so I'm just going to solve it like normal. I'm going to subtract 45 over. When I do that, I get negative 28 is equal to negative 16t squared. When I divide by negative 16, I get 1.75 is equal to t squared. Then take the square root. So I get plus and minus square root of 1.75 is equal to t. But since it's time, I don't care about the negative. So I just want positive square root of 1.75. So square root of 1.75, type that into the calculator, you get 1.32 seconds. So the ball is in the air for 1.32 seconds. Alright, last one. So we're using the given area to find the radius or the diameter to the nearest hundredth. Well, in this case, I'm just looking for the diameter. So if we remember, area of a circle is what? It's pi r squared. Okay? And I know my area to be 34 pi. So I'm going to plug that in. Okay, when I solve for r, divide the pi away, it just cancels out. I get 34 is equal to r squared. Take the square root. That means r is equal to plus or minus 34. But again, it's a circle, so I'm not going to have a negative radius. So r is just equal to square root of 34. But I want the diameter. The relationship between diameter and radius, if we remember, is diameter equals 2 times the radius. So if I want the diameter, I'm going to do 2 times square root of 34. Type that into my calculator, and we get about 11.66 feet. Okay, so like I said at the beginning, you have a quiz tomorrow. It is not over this lesson. If you have any questions, feel free to go ask Ms. Wazalewski or Ms. Brewer. They will be glad to help. But as for now, as the rest of the period, you may get started on your homework and work quietly together.